Welcome to the Dragon's Den. I'm your venerable host Orochi, and today we're going to talk about spellcasting in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition system. This is mostly going to be my problems with spellcasters in general and why I feel there are not any one specific reason, but a whole bunch of reasons why spellcasters just don't feel good to play. If you enjoy playing a spellcaster, then that's fantastic for you. You're going to be needed in a lot of parties. But when I look at it, I am not the kind of player who only wants to be relegated to a support role. And I think that's probably the key problem to spellcasters is that they're all created as a secondary character. Like, you cannot adventure on your own. The difficulty of opponents that you would be able to face by yourself is drastically lower than anything a marshal would go against. So that first and foremost just says right there that you are not equivalent of a marshal. You are not as good as they are. You cannot hold your own. You cannot play by yourself. You are a secondary character in the party. You might be able to build a caster who is a force multiplier, so everybody else in your party is just a lot stronger with you around. That's cool, but unfortunately that is the only good way to play a caster in Pathfinder 2, which I think is a massive problem. But we're going to get into here all the little things, the math, and also the feel of the way spellcasting works that all culminate into why I do not like spellcasters in Pathfinder 2. Right here, this website was the Gamer Sage. He did basically this entire thing that I'm doing right now when the game first came out. He ran a whole bunch of numbers, codified stuff, did comparisons, and all that good stuff. And when Pathfinder 2 first came out, and people were like, oh, spellcasters got nerfed into the ground, blah, blah, blah. I was like, hey, I agreed with a lot of people who were like, spellcasting in 3rd edition, because I didn't play Pathfinder 1, but it was mostly the same. Spellcasting that was friggin' crazy because you could just create your own demi-plane and make yourself immortal and yada, yada, yada. Like, there was just... spellcasting was out of hand. But I have sort of come around to... it's not just a singular thing that makes casters feel bad, but a bunch of things layered on top of each other that's steadily dragged me down over the years. Seeing them in play versus White Room stuff and really just taking a good hard look at the numbers. So he made this chart right here, which is basically, this is all standard marshals and their attack progression versus standard monster or average monster AC going up through the levels. And then standard spellcaster DCs down here as they scale up in level. This is kind of pointless. At the time, this was a really good thing, I think, to get into, but it's pretty much well known now that spellcasters who try to hit AC are at a massive disadvantage because you do not have item bonus to plus to hit that all marshals automatically require in order just to be on par with monsters. Spellcasters don't get that, so they fall behind. They don't even begin to catch up until very, very late levels. And then you're 1 point behind instead of, at your worst, you're 3 points behind. Which is just unacceptable. Like, if you consider that the biggest bonus to the fighter, the thing that makes the fighter one of the best classes in the game, the best damage dealer in the game is because they have a +2 to hit, then thinking, oh, well, I'm only 3 points behind in hit, well, that's basically relegating you to garbage tier. Like, if +2 makes the fighter mind-bogglingly amazing, then being 3 points behind makes you trash. It's not exactly that bad, but it starts getting close. I think being a 2-point difference is tolerable. A 3-point difference would be at the point where it's like, well, you got to start asking yourself, what can you do to make up this deficit? Because it's real bad. And we'll get into more of what you can do about these sort of things later. But just looking at this, standard martials start at needing 10 or above to hit. And this is all inverted, so the higher numbers are better. Because they just wanted to add up to see hit chance or something, I think. But you start off as a 10, you dip down some as monster AC goes up, then you get back, and then dip down, get back, dip down, get back, dip down, and then you eventually come out ahead. For spellcasters, you start there, and it gets better for one level. And then for the rest of your entire career, you're either on par or worse than when you started. That's something to keep note. Worse than when you started or par. And yes, martials are the same way. They're just struggling to keep par with a 50% hit chance, basically. Which here it says that you have a 60% hit rate for standard martial, and you have a 40% for mid save as a caster. It's real bad. It's pretty damn bad. Like in total, I don't think it's that bad. The averages are pretty close. But here's the thing, is like, you're supposed to be targeting low save, but there's several things that make that a non-issue. One, you might not even have that save in any of your spells, because not every tradition has spells that target every save. So that's a massive problem. And then even at your level, there might not be a spell that targets every save. And trying to upcast spells is, by design, less effective than casting higher level spells. So everything about, oh, you have to target saves is stupid. Period. Full stop. Like, the argument that casters are great when you target their low saves, like, that's a whole bunch of just metagame garbage that doesn't work. It makes casters crap, especially when you're either a spontaneous caster who only has a couple spells they can memorize, so you're only going to want like one damage spell unless you want to really hamper your abilities. And even if you're a prepared caster, well, are you going to prepare one of each type in each friggin' spell level that you have? Like, everything about that, you don't have enough slots to really work the entire fantasy of having utility and being able to cover all these different bases. You can't do it. The game's not designed that way. So it's nice when you hit low saves, but otherwise you're generally going to be worse off most of the time. Because at a 40% hit rate, that means 40% of the time you get a success, 50% of the time you get a fail, And also, what? Math. 10% of the time, you get a crit fail. As opposed to only have a 5% crit fail rolling a natural 1 with a martial. So you have twice the crit fail range they do. And I think these averages might have changed some with all the extra bestiaries that came out. And I do kind of feel like these are worse. Anecdotal experience, having played a druid all the way to level 20 in a game, and I felt that the vast majority of my spells were saved against or critically saved against. And when you get a normal failure, it feels like, hey, you won the jackpot because it's so rare. And we'll get into more of that a little bit later, but that's the general feel that I got, and especially from watching other people play as well, that's sort of how it feels. And there's just nothing you can do about that. Because we can look at the numbers for damage. This is our damage calculations. The bottom here is Fireball, your bread and butter, one of the best scaling damages in the game. There's a couple higher level spells that are better. Like, the best damage spell in the game is Chain Lightning. For one simple reason. It's just because you don't need to aim it. Like, every other AoE damage spell, you will only ever be able to get it off in the first round of combat when the enemies are grouped up. And only if you're lucky that you win initiative, which most casters are pretty terrible at initiative because unless you're maxing out your wisdom, which you probably should anyway, casters only get expert in perception, and so you're behind most marshals who get master or legendary. And they're also going to be maxing out their wisdom too. So you're generally a little bit behind in initiative, so you have less of a good chance of starting a fight in a position where you can drop a giant circle of death on enemies. Because the first thing the enemies are going to do, at least half of any enemy squad is going to run at your group and try to surround you or get in on you, and then you're going to be targeting friendlies if you try to drop a giant AoE. So that is the first major hurdle of spellcasters, is that, yes, in a white room, if you could always drop your big bad nuke whenever you wanted to, then maybe your damage might even out to being an all right. But that almost never happens just because of the way play works. Enemies and allies are going to get tangled together, and it's going to be very hard not to hit your allies. And then even when you look at this stuff and just see Fireball is pretty far down here on the damage chart. Like by level 10, you're doing what is that, 26.1 damage versus 37 for Rogue, 44 for Fighter, 46 for Barbarian, and 50 for Dual Wield Fighter, which is the highest damage thing in the game. Like, you're doing half the damage a dual weapon fighter is. So you would think, hey, if you can hit at least 2 targets with your AoE, you're doing the same damage as a fighter. Which, in some ways, might sound alright, but it's not. Simply because the way to win battles is to take targets out. If you're spreading your damage out, then you're not taking targets down. Focus firing is the only way to win battles, because you take out threats and reduce the amount of damage that's coming in, because dead enemies don't do damage. And also, damage at high, like damage percentage versus monster HP at higher levels tends to keep going down. But if you are in a party with heavy hitters who know how to min-max their damage, then you can still get into an area where enemies only take like 3 to 5 hits to kill. And so if you aren't doing like a martial level of damage ever, then you are not changing the number of hits a martial character needs to kill any enemies. So you would have to drop 2 fireballs in order for characters like this to even require 1 less hit to kill an enemy. What does that mean? That means this fireball could hit 20, 30 enemies and it would literally do nothing. Because if before your fireball, your martial characters needed 5 hits to kill the enemy. After your fireball, your martial characters still need 5 hits to kill the enemy. They're just going to be slightly more overkill on that last hit now. That is the big problem with spellcasting, is that it's just not good enough. Like, if you were only dropping, because of your limited number of spell slots per day, and the rare opportunity to really cast good spells to hit lots of targets, spellcasters that do damage are only good in parties where the marshals are also doing AoE damage. In every other party, you would have to relegate yourself to some sort of buff, debuff bot, or a controller, because you're just not useful as damage. And I think that's very unfortunate. That's not like my fantasy as a caster. So none of these spellcasters really fulfill my fantasy for that. And it only gets worse when you start changing things. Because this is moderate save and moderate AC. Like, as soon as you accidentally hit the high, and maybe they do it too, then your numbers go down. But now it's like you're doing 20 damage versus the 44 that the fighter's doing. So now you're doing less than half their damage. You were close to half their damage before, now you're doing less than half their damage. That's very, very bad. And as soon as you pump this up to, oh, hey, you're fighting a very hard enemy that's +3. It's like, well, now you're doing 13 versus the fighter's 24. Which, actually, better for you. Except for the fact that if you're fighting a +3 enemy, there's only going to be one of them, so you're not hitting multiple times for this. So it's going to be bad. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, spellcasters are just for cleaning up weak creatures. It's like, okay, well, if you fight a bunch of weak creatures, then, oh, look at that. It's still only 26 damage versus the fighter's now doing 62. So the fighter's damage has gone up, but yours hasn't really. Even if you're targeting the medium save versus them targeting a medium. You're doing almost 30. Where's level 10? You're doing 32 versus their 68. You're still not even doing half their damage. So even against lower level enemies that spellcasters are supposed to be good at killing, like, your marshals are still going to be doing most of the damage to these things. Unless you're willing to drop like 2 or 3 spells in one battle against lower level enemies. Like, it never equals out to being the things that people say spellcasters are good at. It's never good. And this is problematic because of this right here. We just go boop, and then look at that. Marshals can fairly easily get flat-footed, and I would say if you're in a group that isn't reliably hitting flat-footed enemies, you're in a bad group because it's just a massive force multiplier. 32 damage versus 77. Like, that's a big difference. Even for on-level stuff, 26 versus 62. Like, you would have to hit at least 3 targets, but then the damage is so low that you're not changing the number of hits required to kill something. Unless multiple marshals in your group are specifically built to do AoE damage, like Whirlwind Barbarian or Sweep Barbarian or, you know, an Inventor or something, which that'd be great if you were in a group like that, but I think that's the minority. Most groups are going to be single target massive damage dealers, and they're gonna make you not good at anything. Which is just really, really bad. Because you're doing low damage that's so low that there's going to be a non-insignificant number of situations and party compositions where your damage literally doesn't matter. Unless you are blowing multiple top-tier spell slots, which nobody wants to do. You might not even be able to do. Which is why Chain Lightning is the best spell, because then all the enemy just needs to be sort of near each other, within 30 feet of each other, and you can hit them without hitting friendlies. That sort of makes it the best spell in the game. And since it's lightning, it's actually one of the least resisted damage types as well, so it's kind of the best spell. Just because of ease of use. Like, that alone is massive. Ease of use for a lot of AoEs is really important, because the vast majority of monsters you're going to fight are just the kind that's going to rush up to your party and try to beat you down. That's, you know, a large number of enemies are going to be doing that. And so you're going to be tangling together, and you don't have, within any of the spellcasting classes, the ability to not hit friendlies. And so if you want to be a buff bot or a debuffer, then that's great. There's always room for that sort of stuff in any group, but what happens if you're not in a big group? What happens if you only have 3 people, or your party gets split and it's just 2 and 2? Then, you know, in these sort of situations, what are you bringing to that smaller group that wouldn't be better fit with another marshal? Because as much as a lot of people would like to deny it, the most important thing to do in any D&D game and any D&D offshoot is damage. Damage is the most important thing to do. If your character does nothing else, at least do damage. If you can't do damage, then you need to do bring a lot of other things to the party to make up for that, because you think of all the different situations that your group can get into, and what does a failure mean? If you're doing some roleplay stuff and you're doing diplomacy or whatever, a failed diplomacy is like, well, you're going to piss some people off. What's that going to do? At worst, it gets you into combat. And then what do you need to do? Damage. You get stuck in a trap or a sticky situation or stuff, then yeah, skills are important there. And that's probably the only time where a failure won't result in having to fix the problem with damage. But the vast majority of times where you get into situations where you have to have this skill or that skill and you have to pass this test or you die, feels like shit. And that's usually bad GMing. Like, nobody wants to go out that way. It's not fun, it's not entertaining, it's just not enjoyable. Death in combat is the only real like equalizer for things, and you'd be like, oh yeah, well, I had a lot of chances to do different things, but things just went wrong. Whereas failing 1 or 2 skill checks doesn't feel like you had a lot of choices in order to, avoid that outcome. And the vast majority of other encounters or situations, it's either going to lead into combat, and therefore you're going to need damage, or it's going to be something you can walk away from, or probably feel bad that it was put this way. Like, people don't like that. So, damage is the most important thing to do. That's just kind of like the bottom line. So if you can't bring any damage, you need to be a damage multiplier. If your group has both of those, then those are great. But everything else is like a tertiary desire. Offense is the best defense, period. So if you don't have damage, then you need to have lots of survivability and maybe some other tricks. And if you don't have either one of those, then you need to bring a lot to the group to make up for it. And I do not feel that spellcasters really do that. A lot of people like the sort of things that they have, but I don't. And if you want to go like a spell by spell comparison and breakdown for what the spells do, because this is one of my big problems, is that the spells in Pathfinder 2 are really weak. All of them are just holy crap bad. And Derek here at the Knights of Last Call, you can find them on YouTube, he did this massive undertaking of going through all the spells, got a whole list here. This is 28 videos, and most of them are like 3 to 4 hours long. So this is a massive undertaking if you want to watch all this. I watched like the first 5 or 6 of them, and I can say that I generally agree with Derek's assessment on most of the spells in Pathfinder 2, but I will say the areas that we disagree in would be that he ranks a lot of spells higher than I would because either their mechanics really hit their flavor or they're just really useful at the level you get them at. He'll rate certain spells very high because they're really good at the level you get them at. The problem is that spells in Pathfinder 2 are designed to be weak at higher levels. When you upcast spells, they're weaker than spells of the same level. So you can cast 2 7th level spells, and if one of them was originally a 3rd level spell, say like a fireball, it is inherently going to be weaker than a 7th level spell. You try to cast Fireball versus casting Eclipse Burst, and it's going to do less damage. It's got a smaller area and less damage, but it's got more range. Because Fireball has stupid range for no reason. It's an artillery spell. That's what it was designed at, and it's still kept that flavor, even though there's kind of no real reason for it anymore. But there's a lot of spells where he'll rate them well, because when you get them, they're good. But unfortunately, like 4 levels later, you don't want to be upcasting that shit because it's just not that good anymore, and not that useful, or just what it's bringing to the table for your limited high-level slots is just not enough. But he definitely puts a lot of the spells in the place. Like, there's so many bad spells, and even with his slightly more permissive look at them than I would, in general, every spell level has more bad spells than good spells, and a lot more terrible spells than awesome spells. The awesome spells shine because they're just good and useful, whereas the majority of spells in Pathfinder 2 are super niche. They're like, if you have use of this, it's going to be pretty good, but you need to know that you're going to need this exact spell in this exact moment. And even then, the spell balance it's so low ball. It's so low. Like, it really frustrates me reading spells and then just go, what does this do? Like, I would like to find the video, what video he goes over one of the spells that I thought was going to be awesome, Burning Blossoms. It's like a 6th level spell, I believe. When I got that on my druid, I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And great CC and some damage. But then when you actually look at the mechanics of what it does, it's like, this spell literally doesn't work. It does nothing. It automatically breaks itself whenever you are in combat. But it's a damage spell. And so, like, there's so many spells where it's just like, why does this exist? Why is this written this way? This is not fun. It's not enjoyable in any way. It's just so bad and so frustrating because of that. So then, one of the big problems, the justification in 3rd edition D&D for why spellcasters could just do tons of damage with their spells and just create portals and throw people in them and banish people out of existence and all this stuff. It's like, because they were weak. And so now that spellcasting is very weak, what is the justification for spellcasters being weak? Because all spellcasters have significantly less HP than marshals. Most marshals have 10 HP per level. Combat casters, like the druid and I think the cleric does, have 8 HP per level. And the cloth casters have 6 HP per level. 40% less health than a marshal. And you look at the totals here, total number of save bumps above trained. 8, 8. Bard has 7. Bard's pretty good. It's only 1 point behind some of the better marshals. Champion's pretty bad. 6. Cleric's pretty bad, 5 or 6. Druid is real bad at 5. Fighter 7. Monk 7. Ranger 9. Rogue 9. That's just because they get perception, though. And perception isn't a save for damage. Sorcerer 5, Wizard 5, Investigator 9, Oracle 6, Swashbuckler 8, Witch 5. So 5 is the standard for all cloth casters. 5 or 6 and bards are just better than everybody else. But you look at fighter, monk, barbarian, and even the alchemist have multiple points above where the casters are. Because every martial class has 2 good saves, whereas most spellcasters have 1 good save. Which means that after level 10, martials have 2 saves that when you save, you get a crit automatically, whereas casters only have 1. So casters not only have lower health, but their defenses are lower. Your saves are significantly lower. And it is also much harder for casters to get AC, because if you're a cloth caster, you need to have dexterity as your secondary stats, or you're going to get wrecked. Your AC is going to be lower, and your saves are going to be low. And even if you have medium armor, you still want to get your dex up just for your reflex saves. And it's a perpetual problem that you've got significantly lower health, significantly lower defenses, both AC and saves. And what do you have to make up for it? Like, spells generally aren't fantastic. There's some of them that are good, and you can always white room shit. It's like, oh, well, I can cast haste and then fly and then stone skin and then just not take a lot of damage and cast spells down at stuff. It's like, cool. And, you know, most combats in this game last roughly 4 rounds. So you're going to spend your first round buffing yourself. And then your second round, you're either going to buff yourself or you're going to actually do something useful and cast a spell that does something to combat. Whereas martials are already going to be deciding the fate of the combat by the second round. And that's why, in general, self-buffing is garbage, because you do not have the time to spare. Combat is so fast that you don't have the time to buff yourself. If you're going to be a support character and you want to buff, you buff the strongest martial in the group. Which is very, very unfortunate, unless that's what you want to do. You can go through, you can pick the best spells in the game and be a support character, and you can do really well and feel very useful. But it's a rather narrow path you have to walk to fit into that, and if you start going off that trail some, you start petering off in effectiveness very quickly, and I don't think that's okay. I think casters should be able to stand on their own. Even if it's just, you know, a simple fix for damage stuff would be, like, deadly sorcery should just be, like, standard for all characters should be able to pick it up. Because even then, it's not a lot of extra damage. Or also make it so that, why doesn't flat-footed lower your reflex saves? If flat-footed lowered reflex saves, then you would at least have a chance to spam a lot of these direct damage AoE explosion spells, like Fireball, Chain Lightning. Like, a lot of the good damage spells are reflex saves. So having flat-footed lower reflex would help immensely to help balance the effectiveness between martials and casters, because martials can work together to enhance each other's damage. Somebody in your group should frighten enemies. That makes everybody better and the enemy weaker in every way. But then the martials are also going to inflict flat-footed, which is a big boost to their damage, where it doesn't help the casters at all. So having multiple casters in your group, there's no way that casters can really, you know, work together like that to synergize and do well. And that's a huge problem in the game. Because low defenses, low offense, spells just not as effective as you would hope they are, and poor action economy because all spells are predominantly 2 action, and you don't want to be casting 1 action spells because they're still costing spell slots, which means that they're inefficient usage that way. As just all these little problems collect to just be like, you can make a team of 4 marshals and they will probably be able to get through most things you throw at them. You make a team of 4 casters, any 4 casters, you're probably going to die. They won't survive well at low levels, and even at higher levels when they have high-level spell slots, they're still probably not going to survive. Like, you'd probably be looking at 1 death per, like, medium difficulty fight. Just because of how squishy you are, and you're not putting out enough damage to offset how much easy it is for you to die. And I think nobody wants to play a character who can't solo. Like, because that kind of says you need to be carried. You're so weak, you need a group to carry you. Even against extremely weak stuff, you have to be carried. Whereas if you were a marshal, you could at least have a fighting chance against difficult stuff. You might not win by yourself, but you would at least have a chance. And that's because Pathfinder 2 is designed from the ground up to be played as a group. Everything's balanced around 4-person parties, which I'm going to be making another video soon saying why I don't think that's necessarily a great thing. It's not inherently bad, but I think when you just design something to only fit one thing, anybody who tries to do something slightly different than that is going to have a bad experience. And I don't think that should be the case. I think there's enough room to change a lot of these mechanics to make it so that everybody can have fun doing the things that they think the class fantasy for all these different classes are for. But yeah, I'm more and more becoming a proponent of reworking casters, buffing them in different ways, but it's such a systemic problem with so many spells being so lackluster that even if you had like instant access to your entire spell list to cast whatever spell from it whenever you wanted, so long as you had the slots, that still wouldn't be fantastic because of just how weak all these spells are, which is very frustrating. But I hope that doesn't dissuade anybody who does like casters, because casters can still do really well at crowd control and buffing and debuffing. Not fantastic at it because debuffs are status effects, and really somebody in your group, one of your marshals, should be heading towards legendary in intimidation, get a dread rune, and then they're debuffing. But they're doing single target debuffs, and you're not going to have a lot of luck trying to, put a -2 or -3 status on multiple enemies so that you can get your AoE blast off and do maximum amount of damage, whereas the marshals only need to single target one creature to frighten it, get it frightened 2 or frightened 3, and flat-footed, and they will destroy it. They will absolutely wreck it. And so there's far, far less team synergy for a caster than there are for marshals working together, because marshals will help each other do more damage. Whereas they can help casters do a little bit more damage on a target, but your AoEs are still suffering extremely badly. I do not know how to really get around that sort of stuff unless you very specifically build a group to do AoE stuff, which now that we have a modest group of classes that have different capabilities, I do think that's possible, and I would love to see an AoE based group that has like 2 spellcasters and 2 marshals that do area damage, and see how that works. I would like to see that in action sometime, because I do not know if it would really be worth it over a bunch of marshals just single targeting stuff. But I'll do some more analysis on a couple different things in the future. Hopefully this is the sort of stuff that some people are interested in, because I like seeing all of the ways the mechanics work and how they can support your fantasy for how the game should be played and it boost your enjoyment, versus how sometimes it just feels like the mechanics are, a quagmire of disappointment where you're just sinking down into it, and maybe you don't understand why you're not having fun with something, and a lot of people's good intentioned advice to you just might not be really helpful to you because the mechanics are kind of working against you, and there's only so much you can do about that. Anyhow, that is all for now. Hopefully everyone still has great games to play in and you can enjoy what you're doing. But for now, that is all. See you in the next one.